are those people here? All right, thanks for coming, everybody. Do we need the mic? Yeah, for recording. Okay. All right, it's on? Yep, okay. Great, listen, thanks for coming. And so, as I said, we'll make it interactive and more of a discussion if you'd like. Just feel free to raise your hand and join. So, the point of this discussion is a couple different points. The primary point is that aid in general is under great strain, under attack, for the last couple of years. I think global aid went from roughly $50 billion 2 years ago to around $35 billion currently. That's largely due to the kind of elimination of USAID in the United States. And the pretense, for the most part, is that everything is corrupt. Aid is corrupt. We have, billions of dollars lost, misappropriated, misplaced, et cetera. And some of that is true. Not all of that is true. It was grossly exaggerated. So the question that we think a lot about at the Algorand Foundation, which is basically a layer one public blockchain that anybody can use, is how can you use technology to overcome those objections that people, not just in the United States, but around the world have when it comes to aid? And can blockchain play a role in ensuring transparency, traceability, and of course the immutability of the data that goes on chain? So that's kind of the first objective, and how do we change that narrative using that technology? And the second point is that, this technology allows people, even in the most remote parts of the world, to gain access to a financial world that we all take for granted. So financial inclusion is a big piece of this. So when folks receive stablecoins in a wallet, what is it that they can do with those stablecoins to advance their own financial interests? And I think that's a really important question. We're not there yet in the most remote parts of the world, but that day is coming, and I think blockchain technology will enable that to happen. So to that end, we've got three folks up here to talk us through this, and from different points of view, which I think is interesting, and they're all part of something we put together called the Humanitarian Payments Council, which is this wildly eclectic mix of people from UNHCR to the United Nations World Food Program, to Visa, to WorldPay, to Circle, which is a stablecoin giant, to MasterCard, to United Nations Development Program. And these are three folks who are on the council. The first, for Mercy Corps Ventures, is Sandra Hart, who leads their humanitarian venture lab. Her team's been running some of the most ambitious stablecoin pilots in places like Syria and Afghanistan, cutting transfer times and costs dramatically while working through local NGOs at the last mile. From UNHCR, we have Emily Dery, senior. Actually, I'll go to you, Julia, since in order. From Visa, we have Julia Kuchman, who works on stablecoin product and how Web3 and new money movement rails plug into Visa's global acceptance network. She's part of the leadership around acceptance solution and is thinking every day about how to make payments both more accurate and secure and less painful for merchants, cardholders, and increasingly, which I find really interesting from Visa's point of view, in the humanitarian sector. Emily Dery from UNHCR, she's Director of Integrated Partnerships. She works on U.S. strategy to build partnerships around refugee support, including UNHCR's work with Circle and others to use stablecoins and digital wallets to get assistance to displaced people faster and with more transparency, starting several years ago, like really early on in Ukraine. So very excited to have you folks up here and engage in conversation. So I think the first thing I want to talk about with you, Sandra, you've been in the field for a long time, and you were a pretty early pusher or advocate for the use of stablecoins and Web3 technology. Take us through, what does that look like from point A to point Z, from donor to I'm a beneficiary in Afghanistan, and I've got a low-end smartphone or no smartphone at all, but I get something of value in my wallet that I can spend. What does that process look like?
Yeah, I think the first response to that question is that it's different according to the country and the context, but there are definite trends. And I think UNHCR, Mercy Corps are examples of organizations that have figured out how to build this process into their systems, right? So what it looks like is the organization's global treasury will take money from their bank account, convert it into stablecoin using an exchange, or another type of service like Coinbase, like we all do. They'll send it to the country office where the program is running, like in Syria, where the country office then can see, they receive the funds almost instantly, and they can see the funds in their digital wallet. And what they have are field teams who enroll people for humanitarian aid that go out with tablets. They enroll people. That digital database is uploaded to the HisabPay platform. And the funds in stablecoin are in the country office's HisabPay account, like their bank account in that country. And what they can do is upload that data, select all. It can be 3,000 people, it can be 300,000 people, and click send or disperse. And those people receive a notification that they have just received money that they can spend in the local economy at local shops around them, and those shops are HisabPay agents. And those agents will then themselves, after people have received their aid, those agents will go and cash out those funds locally. So it's a way of drawing like a direct digital line between the organization and the beneficiary. Like that is a chain of custody, basically.
What level of literacy? I mean, in Afghanistan, I think there's almost 100% illiteracy rate among women, particularly. How does that work? How does that work?
Yeah.
Literate woman, both real literacy and digital literacy. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, I think mobile adoption is accelerating, and that includes the old ladies of Afghanistan. People know a good tool when they see one. People in emerging markets where Mercy Corps Ventures invests are paying by SMS already. This is already happening in Africa. It's been happening for almost 20 years. So I think we underestimate the capacity of people in crisis to adapt and learn very quickly because their life depends on it. So and actually you see more demand from beneficiaries to learn. You know, people in programs who were like, I know this device gives me aid, but it also connects me to the rest of the world, to my family who might have emigrated somewhere else. Yeah. You know, so people are resourceful. Yeah. They know what to do with digital technology if you can put it in their hands.
I think about stablecoins, Julia, you know, often crypto is conflated with blockchain and I mean, stablecoins is a kind of crypto in a sense, but much more trustworthy and obviously regulated, et cetera. Talk about the use of stablecoins in these environments from Visa's point of view and why that is beginning to become a somewhat preferred, where you're thinking about it, making it a preferred means of payment.
It's a great question, and I'm not sure how much of the literacy in this room is around the different types of coins out there and the difference between crypto and stable coins, but I think the core piece to take away to your question is not all coins are created equal. Yeah. And I think that one of the aspects that's really helped the ecosystem get more and more comfortable with stable coins is a unique type of technology is some of the regulation and protections that have come out around what does it mean to, thank you, what does it mean to issue a stable coin in a way that follows some of the guidance that's been put out, for example, in the U.S. with the Genius Act. And there's similar types of acts that have both preceded and are fast follows to that around the world. And so we, as part of deciding to power that type of technology, we do an in-depth review of the different issuers of those coins to make sure that they're really up to the right standard in terms of consumer protections, like when you're onboarding someone, how confident are we that they've done diligent checks to make sure that it's getting in the right hands of people, and we know the source of funds, and that there's ongoing kind of holding of the reserves against that, right? And so I think, though, overall you see more and more regulation, which gives more comfort to continue to have stablecoins be treated just like any other currency, and to have it hold the same type of weight, and ultimately you can rely on it just like you would another type of fiat currency.
And Emily, I'm kind of a little bit on that same vein in terms of stablecoins in the United States, within the aid sector being looked at as maybe this is a way to get something into the hands of people. But UNHCR sits at this gigantic scale, and they're doing incredible work in Afghanistan with digital payments. They're probably going to move into Syria in a relatively big way. But as the partnerships lead for UNHCR, what do you see in your day-to-day when it comes to the feeling around aid within the United States and some of your partners? Like, what are you hearing that's kind of happening now, and what do you see as maybe the future, especially within the U.S.?
Yep, it's a great question. Thanks. So I think in the U.S., we've seen that there is a general skepticism around the traceability of aid, the transparency of aid. As you started with, there is sometimes the belief that aid is corrupt, or even as Julia mentioned, there's leakage in the system. So as a lot of money is moving through the aid system, where does it go? Might it leak out? So I think what we see at UNHCR, the potential with stable coins and other kind of digital currencies, is that it's really an evolution of aid. So cash has long been known as the best form of aid to provide to individuals or families in a crisis, because they can have the dignity of choice to decide, what does our family need right now? Maybe it's access to health care, maybe it's reinforcing homes or shelter, or maybe it's reinvesting in their business so they can get right back into income generating activities in a crisis. No matter what it is, having access to capital themselves is key. But managing large amounts of cash, distributing large amounts of cash is complex, and we face all kinds of security risks. So moving that onto digital rails and then evolving that even further to stable coins or other kind of digital currencies allows, again, more choice and flexibility around market volatility, inflation of currencies. So we see that's what the trajectory that we've seen, that we've long known cash is an excellent form of aid for individuals. We move about $6 billion of aid a year through UNHCR. 2/3 of that is now digital, and then stablecoin is the next area for us. So we had pilots together in various countries, and we're hoping to continue evolving in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I was with the United Nations World Food Program back in the early 2000s for about 5 years, and back then it was so much of it was in kind. You know, food would come in from Norway and Denmark and the United States, and it would be distributed locally, and it never made much sense to me then. But this trajectory has been real. And I think for a lot of agencies, multilaterals, and international NGOs, it's going to be the overwhelming majority of how people receive funds. Is that what you're seeing, Sandra? And then secondly, from the NGO perspective, and we've got a multilateral, we've got Visa, we've got an INGO perspective. NGOs carry a lot of risk, right, as well. So just two questions packed into that.
Yeah, I think, well, in a way, it's funny because so my job, like in the sector for a long time, was food distribution with WFP, and then being a cash transfer specialist, which is basically like, there's a crisis, you go there, you figure out how to pay 250,000 people that you don't know and that you've never met in a country where the financial infrastructure has been destroyed, or otherwise impacted by a crisis. And that is a very, very complex job. And when you break that job into processes, it's kind of self-evident that doing that digitally would be a lot easier. It would save a lot of time, save a lot of cost. And that was the argument to move from giving people stuff to giving people a single payment that they can use themselves to purchase the stuff that they need, rather than you spending time and effort and money to give them something that they may not need that day at that time, right? So I think this is definitely part of that evolution. And I also think that, we don't have a choice in the sector. USAID is gone. The sector is really, in a way, it's like a market correction. We were talking about this last night, right? That this sector is contracting, and the number of humanitarian crises are multiplying. So how do you do more, better, with less? And this is part of the solution to that question.
I want to ask why, is that part of the reason why Visa has come in? Because you see kind of where the puck is headed, you see this kind of new emergence of cash transfers. Is that part of the reason?
A great question, and I was going to build on this point you're making around the imperatives around why move into stable coins, why start looking at expanding our rails into cryptocurrency. And just to give some data points around this, so the stable coin supply, it varies estimates, but somewhere around 150 to 300 billion, and that's the size of some mid-sized economies currencies, right? And interestingly, that number has grown over 50% year on year, and we see it on that trajectory, and if anything, it's going to accelerate. right? So the way that we look at this is just as QR-based payments or buy now, pay laters or digital wallets were new at one point. Apple Pay was new at one point, right? If you think back just 10 years ago and change, this is the next wave. And so I think ultimately we're in the business of helping businesses and consumers pay and be paid in the way that they prefer. So that preference is really key because the end user, because it's faster, it's less expensive, it's more traceable, the benefits are there, so the users will move there no matter what. Yeah. There will always be a provider to meet their needs. And so one of our focuses is how can we look at basically extending our rails. So in a case where perhaps a program might want to have a mix, they might need to do account-to-account payments sometimes, they might need to do prepaid cards and other times, and now they might want to just be ready in case stablecoin adoption really picks up in the market that they're operating in. They don't have to kind of pick a whole bunch of different providers. They can come to one that gives them the flexibility to grow into these new types of use cases as might be relevant for them.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And I guess, Emily, too, on the Digital Hub for Treasury Solutions at UNHCR, was that set up? And I know that UNHCR just got a big donation from Circle and really invested in making this work. Can you talk about the genesis of that a little bit and what the thinking was behind that?
Sure. So I think a lot of what
because I think it kind of plays into what Julia said, really.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think so the genesis came from a lot of these points already around realizing that digital is key for the present and for the future, that there's a need to simplify and streamline the rails and the forms of payments, whether it's accounts, whether it's wallets, et cetera. So the Digital Hub of Treasury Solutions was launched by UNHCR and a few other UN agencies to streamline payment systems from all of these agencies into a single process, into single rails. So now we are bringing together UNDP, for example, UNHCR, the Institute of Migration, World Food Program, so many others who are all doing the same activities, but historically separately, sending payments to the beneficiaries, perhaps sending them for food, but then UNHCR is sending for access to healthcare. And now what we're doing is streamlining all of that together. So there will be billions of transactions that are going to be happening because of this aggregated digital hub of treasury solutions now. But the reasoning for that was aggregation, streamline needs, but also what Sandra had started with, that the amount of aid in the sector has shrunk. It will not likely grow tremendously in the near future, but yet crises are expanding, the number of crises, and they are complex in nature. So we needed to find a way to give better aid faster and in a more sustainable way that reduces the dependency on aid over the long term. So the benefits, too, with wallets, whether it be for stablecoin or for cash, is that individuals and families can hold on to those wallets. And it's not just for use in an emergency now, but you could use that wallet to invest in your business later on. So we are building financial literacy skills, investing in financial inclusion, but also into the long term so that individuals have access to banking services and can help take them out of a crisis and out of this reliance on aid in the long term. So it's not just the evolution of cash and the responses of humanitarian needs at the onset of a disaster, but also how can you transform needs in an emergency to long-term sustainability or financial inclusion, et cetera. And as Sandra said, communities know a good tool when they see one, and once they have it, they'll want to keep using it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe, Sandra or Emily, you talk about sustainability and financial inclusion. So if you haven't been in the field working and you talk about these things, you think that's a pipe dream, and maybe it is. Maybe it's years down the road, but is it? Like when somebody receives, there's a London School of Economics report on, they followed 2,000 women in Afghanistan. It was a randomized trial. And they found that when women receive something of value in their wallet over blockchain rails, good things happen. Their families suffer less hunger, there's less violence, there's less corruption. But that's just the beginning, right? Talk a little bit more, because I'm personally really interested in this, on the sustainability part. When they get something of value in their wallet and they keep it there for a period of time, what does that mean? Like, practically, why does that matter?
Sure. So I think to take us back to how Sandra initially described the process. So in Ukraine, for example, this was the first time that UNHCR moved into stablecoins as a form of humanitarian aid. So when individuals were moving within Ukraine or crossing a border, you had to register with UNHCR to then be registered as someone who's internally displaced or someone who's a refugee in a second country, for example. After registration, an individual would receive a text message to download a wallet app, for example. Once they downloaded that app, then they were receiving a notification that they were getting a payment to that app. And then an individual could decide to cash out the payment at that moment or hold on to it. So in Ukraine, we saw some people moving within the country for safety or crossing borders. Because in Ukraine we worked with MoneyGram, Ukraine had over 4,500 cash out points of MoneyGram. But then they also existed in Poland and other countries. So individuals could make the best choices that they needed for their own financial needs and cross into Poland perhaps, if that was safer for them, and keep the funds in their wallet the whole time and in stable coins and then cash it out in Poland. And someone could move even farther distances if they wanted to. So you're allowing people to make strategic financial decisions that they are capable of doing all on their own without deciding when and where and how much will they get. Or in Argentina, for example, with market inflation and volatility, inflation rose over 200%. And there we saw that we were able to use wallets again to give stable coins. Individuals could use them in the short term, but we saw people quickly pivoted into reinvesting in their businesses for income generating activities and then wanted to hold on to the wallets for further business use. So we see that there's this natural inclination for strategic use of their own funds.
So, okay, great. In a place like Ukraine that works, but in a place like Syria or Afghanistan, because the off-ramping is hard, right? So you've set up, along with Saab and Algorand, a number of Hawala networks within Syria. But isn't that one of the things to overcome if you want to get to scale, is solving that off-ramping question?
You know, I don't
not,
think
I don't know.
that is what is inhibiting scale. You know, aid delivery is already hard, right? Our field teams have a lot of experience, you know, doing things like distributing cash in envelopes and organizing thousands of people in order to do so. You know, it's not a big jump, you know, to ask them to go into the field and help people learn how to use a digital device to access aid and leave that device and that access to finance in the hands of that individual. That is not that difficult. But we also forget that, like, economies don't stop. People are still buying things from each other. People are still economically active, right? And in a lot of these countries, the traditional or like bricks and mortar financial infrastructure has either been destroyed or sanctioned, like in the case of Syria and Afghanistan, or wasn't very good to begin with, and then has been destroyed by gangs in Haiti. Like, can you imagine how difficult it is to move physical cash, you know, when it's gangland? So I think in a lot of these contexts, you're sort of seeing a trend that people are recognizing the value of digital financial infrastructure, you know? And in places like Haiti, where nobody knows when the state will be operational again, you know, we've been working on a pilot with a local microfinance bank. That's your payout system, you know? And this is really where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of, like, how is this technology putting in place the digital financial infrastructure in a place where physical financial infrastructure may be slow to rebuild or may not be feasible to rebuild at all. And if we live in a world where we're moving more towards digital payments, it's a fundamental injustice not to braid that into your approach. Right. If you say you want to prevent, you want to make people more resilient, you know, you want to make sure people can recover from a crisis.
What gives you pause about, what gives Visa pause about that?
Well, I was going to expand a little bit on different ways that I've seen that off-ramp work. One of the main avenues that we've been able to power for the ecosystem is stablecoin linked cards. Yeah. So I'm not sure how much folks may know about this, but this is effectively you're able to use a card and spend down against a balance that is in your stablecoin wallet. So what that allows for is anywhere in the world, there's the 175 million merchants that Visa's connected to, you can still have that stablecoin balance be spent like at a coffee shop or at anywhere that Visa is accepted. Obviously, there's nuance, and as to your points on, how good is the card acceptance ecosystem in some of these markets in different contexts, right? But I know our teams had examples of when they come in and work with, certain specific merchants to make sure that groceries can get out during an emergency, and kind of there's workarounds there. But I do think that stablecoin linked card one is going to continue to remain a trend. It's grown up to 5 billion in volume this year, up from 1 billion a couple years ago. So massive growth in terms of demand for, hey, I have my stablecoin balance. I might want to hold it in there, to your point, because my currency is volatile, but I do still want to retain the flexibility to spend it anywhere that Visa is accepted. And then I do think you alluded a little bit to this, but the partner banks, so off-ramping to Stables balance to a bank, I think the banks are going to start to get more comfortable with this. Back to some of the points I was making in the beginning around certain trusted coins, certain trusted providers that are compliant, that do have strong reputations. It'll make it feel easier to allow for that balance to be converted and then held into their account.
I think there's also something about small merchants and the way that economies, like very agile economies in crisis contexts work, is that you're also lowering the access barrier for these guys to enter the digital economy. It's way cheaper for a woman who's selling vegetables and moving from market to market every day to accept digital payments using stablecoins, which is something that she may not otherwise have access to the financial system to be able to do, and so that means that the spendability of aid, that money is circulating in the local economy, amongst the people who need it, but also the people around the people who need it.
And to Sandra's point too, all of the work that we're doing with UNHCR around stablecoins is generating activity within the local economies. Yeah. So we are working with Keller, for example, or an Algorand to help us tap into the network. But that network is going all the way down to the small local merchants for payouts or for payments. So even the concept of using stablecoins allows us to determine what is the best value we can get for aid for a community within a given context. Maybe it is stablecoin, and that's how we're working with Circle for the USD coin. But maybe in certain contexts, it's not. Maybe it's tokens, actually, of the local currency. But again, that is the financial literacy and financial education we're doing with local economies. And it's a huge way of also moving out or moving beyond the reliance on aid. Because if we can provide a currency and payouts that individuals can use, local merchants can tap into, and that stimulates the local economy, then individuals are not waiting for a cash disbursement around a certain time for a specific amount. They're able to spend as they want, move as they want. And for returnees in Afghanistan or even in Syria, it's one of the largest barriers that we hear from communities, that there are so many Syrians, perhaps in Jordan, who want to return to Syria. But at this point, the infrastructure is still not rebuilt. So there are concerns around safety, naturally. There are concerns, are there schools available for my children? But also, are there financial institutions and infrastructure? How can I restart a business? Can I retrieve money? Can I put money back into a bank? So as the brick and mortar businesses of all kinds are being rehabilitated and rebuilt in countries like Afghanistan and Syria, digital tools allows the economy to actually come back and leapfrog over some of these infrastructural challenges that we're seeing. And then returnees can return with payments in their wallet and stimulate the local economy simultaneously.
So aren't those countries exactly the countries where blockchain can actually start this financial infrastructure from scratch, a banking system from scratch, where none exists really in Syria, none really exists in Afghanistan, none really exists in Libya. I mean, there's traces of it, and some 8% of the population, I think, in Afghanistan can avail themselves of banking institutions. So that's where this really works, right? I mean, is that correct?
That is correct, and I think that there's a huge potential.
Because you're not going to go to Kenya or someplace that has M-Pesa or whatever. Mm-hmm. This is building something from scratch where nothing exists.
I think there is huge potential, and I think we talked about this last night too, that the technology isn't the challenge. I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing is alignment around all of the institutions, the ecosystem. So a lot of trust building internally within countries, within various sectors of the financial system. Financial literacy has to happen, financial education and digital means, but then all of the various merchants, internal, external to the business. And that's what we see at UNHCR too. And the benefit of DHOTS, the Digital Hub of Treasury Solutions, is building all of this at scale. So you don't have to do the trust building, the education, the payment rails, all of the infrastructure, agency by agency, country by country, community by community. We have economies at scale at our advantage. So absolutely, I think there's a huge potential to rebuild using blockchain, but I think it's the human factor. It's all of the trust building, the behavior change that would have to go along with it.
Yeah, yeah. And from Visa's perspective, in places like Syria and Afghanistan and Libya and Yemen, places where the Humanitarian Payments Council is really focused, what gives you pause if you were to enter or contemplate entering those markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a sort of normal set of concerns you would think through around, can I really trust that the funds are being sent from someone I trust and getting received by someone who's been onboarded in line with, regulatory standards that we have around like sanction screening and aspects like that. But I think, going back to your point around where this technology is going to really take root, I think, yes, it will be in places where there is some rebuilding, but we do see it in a number of different sort of market archetypes, if you call it that, around the world. So including Kenya, it's in markets where perhaps there is volatility in the currency, perhaps there's high digital adoption in stablecoin for other reasons. So we think about it as it's not just that one kind of market set. There's a number of them, including in the US, where if it ultimately comes down to is stablecoins potentially a rail that's faster, cheaper, and easier to use than just my preference. And you can imagine that unlocks a wider set of markets beyond just this one type that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and the ability to trace that and see in real time that where those dollars are going, which actually reminds me, I wanted to show a video, a 2-minute video of something called the Aid Trust Portal that we developed. And it's central in some ways to this discussion because, again, what we're trying to do is to change the narrative around aid. We know that cash direct transfers are beneficial to people receiving them. Economies prosper as a result. But the big question for a lot of donor governments is, where does this money go? Can we see it? So we developed something called the Aid Trust Portal. It's a 2-minute video. I want you to watch it and maybe get your reactions from the audience, from our panelists, to see, does this allay any fears that you might have if you were a government official, if you're Visa, if you're UNHCR, or whomever, right? What does this mean to you in terms of how you view aid? So if you could cue that video, that would be great.
Billions of dollars in humanitarian aid flow around the world every year, funding that saves lives, provides stability, and supports people in their most vulnerable moments. But tracking that money has always been a challenge. Each organization reports its own activity, and the complete flow, from original source to final beneficiary, has never been visible in one place. A mature public blockchain like Algorand changes this. Every payment becomes not just visible, but traceable and verifiable in real time on an immutable ledger. And now, with the Aid Trust Portal, that data is more than verified. It's accessible and interactive for everyone in the system. Here's how it works. An organization sets up its project by uploading the public wallet addresses of all known accounts associated with its work, its own disbursement wallet, plus any local partners, agents, vendors, or beneficiaries across the globe. They specify which digital asset to trace, such as USDC or another stablecoin, and label each wallet by its role, like on-ramp or beneficiary. The portal then pulls together all relevant public blockchain data and maps the flow of funds visually. In this example, we can see stablecoin funds moving from a crypto exchange to the aid agency's master wallet and on to aid recipients. We can even see what the recipients ultimately utilize their aid for as the funds move on again to a utility company to cover electricity bills. All core wallets in the system belong to fully KYC'd known actors. An integration with industry-leading blockchain intelligence company Elliptic also flags any wallet, even unknown ones, that has interacted with suspicious accounts. You choose your view, toggle between total transaction volume, transaction count, or average transaction size. Visualize the money flow, net inflows and outflows, or transactions over time, or drill down into a full view of every individual transaction. The Aid Trust portal by Algorand gives humanitarian organizations, and the donors who support them, clear, real-time, verifiable visibility into exactly where funds are going every step of the way. So the money that's meant to change lives actually does. Learn more at aidtrust.io.
So what do you think of that? Is that a good tool? Is that, I mean, from Visa's perspective, you look at that, what does that say to you?
I think it's great. It's really exciting. I think it's clear. I think it's a type of asset that you could take and sit down with all the teams that you might need to engage with, right? From, if any of you are leading organizational change, to sit down with legal, to sit down with compliance, to sit down with your regulatory team and talk them through, hey, here's why I'm getting comfortable with this and why I think this is a good idea. It helps to have assets like those that bring it to life.
Yeah, and you were in Berlin at the Humanitarian Payments Council when we unveiled that.
Yeah, this is a very funny anecdote, right? So I'm running this pilot in Syria with HisabPay and the Algorand Foundation. And when I arrived at the airport in Berlin, the country office was like calling me to say, like, where's the crypto? We haven't received it yet. What's going on? It was just them being disorganized, But while we were in Berlin, we pulled up the transparency portal. I'm managing this pilot, and the amount of relief that I had to be able to pull it up and see those transactions happening on screen, I was like, great, the problem from this morning has been solved, and I'm seeing it happen right in front of me. And that's a live pilot that was visible in real time to us, as that group. But as like a program management tool, it's also great for oversight. Like, you can course correct, you're constantly troubleshooting in these programs. And when you can see live transactions that way, you can take more responsive and reactive action, to that, which makes for a better experience for people in crisis who should have an aid system that works well for them.
Yeah. I mean, from UNHCR's perspective, it's got to be a good thing, right? You're partnership lead, so.
Exactly, absolutely. I think there's so many good consequences from this that, first, I will say the security measures put in place for beneficiaries to actually retrieve aid are much higher than us and our own bank accounts and banking cards. So, for example, when you register with UNHCR, we are taking biometrics because so often refugees have lost documentation. Forms of ID, any kind of deed to a property, things like that. So we take biometrics. So I had to do this myself when I was in Jordan recently to access an account where we are then depositing aid into, and other UN agencies are depositing aid into. You walk up to an ATM and the ATM scans your retina, because that is the biometric scan that we are taking when we are first meeting refugees or internally displaced people. So you register with your name, the country that you're in, your retina scan, and that becomes how you retrieve funding. So down at the beneficiary level, the security measures are in place, but to be able to track payments from Circle, for example, perhaps, or an Algorand of this is the funding that came in for humanitarian aid, moved through UNHCR accounts, like we saw in the video, all the way down to beneficiaries, and then, which I know matters to Visa, to see then how individuals are using this, not from a surveillance standpoint, but again, from a program design standpoint, it allows us to understand, so what are the needs? And we're able to see, oh, communities are spending a lot on food right now, or a lot on healthcare, or a lot on shelter, and we can then help in our own program design in that way. But as a partnerships person, my job all day, every day is to motivate institutions and individuals to contribute to our organization, to convey how much we care about trust, transparency, credibility, security of all of these payments. And I think having this tool would help allay any fears around aid.
And one other build on this point, I think where it can also be helpful is if you're interacting with a bank on either side of that network. So for funds to get in or funds to get out through any type of fiat or account-to-account transfer, or even if it's a card, because what the bank's going to be concerned about is, am I being party to a transaction that's going to lead to some sort of illegal activity or something that I don't want to be involved with, that's against my risk policies and all of these sorts of things. So being able to walk through, how does transaction screening work? Are we able to hold funds? Whose job is it to look at this data? All of that sort of really the compliance, ongoing operational aspects of it. If there's elements within that tool that can be helping to give confidence on that traceability, I think it's also helpful in influencing those stakeholders to participate.
Yeah, I mean, banks' appetite for risk is a huge part of this, right? I mean, that's key. So in 5 years, from Visa's point of view, and you're very integral to the stablecoin discussion at Visa, and other things as you've talked about last night. But where is Visa in 5 years in this field specifically? Stablecoins generally, agentic commerce, but specifically in the humanitarian, at the humanitarian level, where are you guys in 5 years?
Great question. So I think we're going to end up in a spot where we have an open, flexible, and trusted infrastructure platform that ultimately gives flexibility. So I think stablecoins will have faded into the background in terms of it's just another rail, just like it's still treated as another currency, or the different chains are almost like different banking partners. Well, there'll be kind of an extended set that we're connected to, an extended set of stablecoins that we support, right? And ultimately, what that's going to do is still allow for our partners to cater to a cash-based use case in markets where cash is still going to be king, right? But all the way to powering a digital stablecoin wallet for end recipient and everyone in between. Because I think the reality is, in these types of more complex scenarios, there's going to need to be a flexible stack that ultimately providers can use to adapt. So even 5 years from now, I do expect there's going to be a whole lot of kind of in between, but stablecoins will increase in terms of their adoption, if that makes sense. More of the mix will have gone there, but we'll remain needing some sort of blended hybrid type of world.
So it won't be news. Right.
Yeah, it'll be kind of like the plumbing. It'll be it'll be exciting that we have this sort of flexible set that you can tap into, but there'll be something new by then.
Yeah, but with meaningful change. I mean, you always hear it's going to transform the world. It's going to change the world. But in real ways, on the ground, I mean, UNHCR sees it when refugees receive something of value in their wallet. That's a big change in the lives of people. So I kind of want to ask you, Emily, what's UNHCR? I mean, UNHCR has been a leader in this and adoption and really pushing the envelope on this stuff. Within the next few years, where will you be as an agency vis-a-vis direct aid into the hands of your growing refugee population?
Sure. So I think just to ground us in a moment too, we talked a lot about aid and transparency and trust, but also something that I talk about a lot is then over-reliance on aid. Right. So I think about, and our agency thinks about, that's why I use the word sustainability. How can this be sustainable, and how can we get people into income-generating activities so there's less reliance? But as a starting point, only 44% of refugees live in countries where they can open a bank account without restrictions. With that fact alone, we are not able, as a world, to move beyond aid because of that. So digital wallets, digital currencies, blow right past that stat. Now they're able to have an account, bring cash in, support their families, start businesses, and then contribute to local economies. So I do think in the next 5 years, UNHCR's cash program will move from being 3/4 of a digital program to more and more of a digital program. I don't know that we'll get to 100%, but I think it'll become more and more digital. And then I think, like Julia said, I think stablecoin, blockchain will become less news and more of just another way of working. Just as we know accounts, wallets, cards are 3 common forms of rails at this point and use cases for individuals. I think stablecoins will be another. And then I think the idea of a stablecoin card is something that'll be very interesting for our agency to explore in the future, because at this point, cash is still king. We might be doing all of this, that's very innovative, but the goal is to always pay out for cash. Yeah. But maybe we can get to a place where you don't have to pay out for cash, and instead there can be a secure form of using stablecoin and paying with stablecoin. So I think it's a continued evolution in this way, stablecoin and tokenization of local currency, which we're also doing, and more digital and less news, more business as usual eventually.
And Sandra, you've been engaged in this for a number of years. From the earliest days, you were an adopter, an originator. Would you have said the same thing if I asked that question 5 years ago? Or has the pace been very slow? And do you think that's correct? Within the next few years, it's just kind of a little bit of background noise. It's the plumbing. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I think it's been slow so far, but the disruption that we see now in the aid sector, I think it will kickstart adoption in ways, that we didn't see before, because it's about adaptation, right, to a changing reality. So I think that, but with that, you also have sort of changes in the power dynamics in the aid sector. Who can innovate fastest? Who's agile enough to adapt their systems to the use of stablecoins? For example, small local NGOs are way faster at that than like big, organizations like Mercy Corps. But even Mercy Corps operates on a digital-first cash policy, right? So like we will always look first for the digital tool that can get us to deliver aid that way before we look at other tools. So for Mercy Corps, this is just another way to deliver cash digitally. And I think that banalization of things is actually a very good thing. But at the same time, I hope to see more power and sort of like a bigger role for local NGOs and local startups who know how to build this best and who are going to be there when the internationals are gone. And I think that's an entry point that leads to diversity in the blockchain ecosystem, but we also have to be humble and solve our own sort of misaligned power dynamics in the sector. We talk about decolonizing aid, and putting like powerful digital tools in the hands of people who've been like historically denied access to infrastructure is a big deal, and I really hope to see more local actors front and center. And I think actors like HisabPay and the work they do with local NGOs in Afghanistan is a really good example of that. So I think we're headed in an interesting direction, and for once, we don't have the luxury of not trying it, because the sector is so sort of resource stressed.
That's a good way to end it. That's a good note to end on. So we have a few minutes left. If you guys have any questions, comments, please feel free. I don't think you need, well, you can go to the microphone if you want, I guess for recording purposes, but go ahead. If anybody has something, go ahead.
Hi, well, thank you, everyone. It's been very interesting. Oh, sure.
Sorry, bad information.
All right. Thank you, everyone. It's been a very interesting discussion. I thought the dashboard was fantastic. It looks like it's something that's easily accessible, has nice data analytics, and is a very user-friendly interface. To play devil's advocate, I have a question. So with regard to the sort of protocols that are there protocols in place to identify suspicious vendors, accounts, and who decides that? Is it something from a platform perspective, or is it a consensus of donors? Like, who decides what's suspicious and how is that acted upon? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a combination of those things. First, the regulatory trends. Existing financial regulations in the US, in major jurisdictions, like the US, like the EU, already have set criteria for how closely you need to scrutinize transactions. There are compliance rules. So we're really just digitizing compliance in that way. These are set lists. OFAC has a list. The EU has a list. There are UN sanctions lists that we all need to screen against anyway. But instead of doing that through like 3 or 4 different platforms, we're building that into a single platform that can screen in the background in real time. And unfortunately, those screening requirements are because of the scrutiny on the aid sector to make sure aid doesn't get into the wrong hands. So we have a double burden of compliance. Is first, aid needs to get in the right hands, but secondly, you have to do it compliantly in a sanctioned jurisdiction, which is a whole nother, bag of chips. So, yeah.
And then down, I'll just say down to the individual level, or actors, maybe at small merchants or things like that. Sandra walked us through the kind of architecture of the aid world or the humanitarian world, and talking about country operations and field teams and things like that. So all of the work that's done at the community level to identify perhaps financially insecure households or financially insecure people, or the local merchants that are allowed, at least in my context, to work within a refugee camp or within a refugee setting, or a host community, for example, there is a lot of localization that happens. There is so much work that's done with local partners, our teams operating in countries are nationals from those countries as well. So there's a lot of human-to-human interaction and screening that's also happening, despite having this large digital architecture that we're talking about. So I do think that it is both global but also hyper-localized in ways that we perhaps don't talk about enough.
Yeah, and I mean, just to one last thing on that is the more we make these systems easy to use and efficient, the more field teams have to sit down with the community and have a conversation about what people need to respond to feedback, when aid is maybe difficult to access. So this frees up time to be delivering in a way that's closer to the community for the people who were there, because those boots are already on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, and just to build on these points, I agree with everything you said. I think something that's interesting is in many markets, the digital asset regulation hasn't yet come to bear. So we've talked about, US and Europe have sophisticated schemes. In other markets, it's newer or it's being formed. And so one tactic that I've seen that can be helpful is for technology providers that are working in this space, they follow what is their view of the most sort of stringent, most high standard kind of compliance mindset to go in when operating these types of programs. And even though they don't have to by the letter of the law, they're kind of holding that reputation for themselves by moving into markets and still retaining that same level of high scrutiny. So I think that can be helpful in some of these cases too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this is at my height, I think. Okay. Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I have so many questions, but I'll stick to one of them. One of the actors you guys didn't talk about as much is local governments and how they're interacting with this. And if you can talk specifically about the local governments that are often the hardest, or in areas where Syria is just going through major transition, and other humanitarian, like the war zone type of areas. If you can talk about those governments as well. How are they reacting to it? How are they adapting or maybe not adapting to it? What are your challenges around facing the local governments? Thank you.
You talk about Syria, and you can talk about maybe Afghanistan.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Syrian government is way ahead of us on this one. That's the case in Syria. But for example, I led Oxfam's pioneering blockchain project, and I had to sit down with the central bank governors and explain what blockchain was, and really have this conversation around improving compliance systems in a country that is also considered a tax haven, and they were very intrigued by this. So I think humanitarian actors have the potential to play a brokering role as a trusted partner to local government, but also to introduce new tools in the hands of local governments, like for disaster risk prediction, and tying that in with automated payments when the monsoon season is on the way, and a place is going to flood in 72 hours. So they're also users of the technology as well. So I think they have a very multidimensional role in all of this, but humanitarian actors have the access to engage at that level. Yeah.
I would definitely agree. And I would say that in certain places like Afghanistan, for example, or even we're thinking about doing this in Sudan, for example, there is a question I mentioned earlier about what is the best value for cash that we can offer to constituents. So we've used stablecoins, but we're also using tokenization. So in Afghanistan, for example, there were still sanctions. And because of regulatory issues, we weren't able to, and maybe in some contexts it doesn't make much sense, to bring in a USD coin. for example. Perhaps it would, even if we can from a regulatory standpoint, it would set up a parallel structure or a parallel economy. And we don't want to be doing that either as the UN. We want to be building local economies and strengthening local economies and expanding capacity, not coming in thinking we have a capacity that we can just build and dump elsewhere either. So tokenization is a second part of our digital evolution. It's not just stablecoins. So tokenizing local currencies allows us to move through digital rails, be innovative, but work with with the governments at a local level in whatever format works best for them. Perhaps because it is sanctions, perhaps it's just because it's what they prefer to stimulate their own economy. So that's what we did in Afghanistan, for example. And we saw that that worked really well. We were able to move $20 million, for example, and supported 500,000 people. And so again, you talk about the digital divide or these digital tools, but we can impact enormous scale if we kind of shake out some of our traditional mindsets or beliefs around some of this. So working with local governments, like any government, requires sitting down and negotiating, but then we'll find the best solution for that context.
Yeah.
Thanks for all you're doing and for sharing it with us. I'm just curious to know to what extent U.S. State Department is buying into this, supporting these new efforts to sort of streamline things financially and make things more transparent.
I mean, so from what I've read and the couple of conversations I've had, they're very, very interested in blockchain rails as a delivery system to people in need. And so that, to me, is a breakthrough. We're having our Payments Council meeting in Washington in July specifically for that reason. We're going to invite people in from Treasury, from key members from Capitol Hill, to really get to understand why this matters. And again, the reason that we're doing this as a foundation, and me personally especially, is because I think this gives us the opportunity to change the narrative around aid specifically in the United States, given all that's happened, because I think it's so important. It bloated? Is there some corruption? Yes, to all of that. But this is life-saving stuff, and this, to me, is a way to flip the script. So I think we're out of time. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening. We really appreciate it, and please ask us any questions afterwards, and thanks.
Thanks, everyone.